I'm going to attempt to share my screen again. So let's do this. Okay, do you see a slide that says cover crop termination and in-season corn soybean weed control?
Yes, we do.
Okay, all right. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to hit on a number of different topics, and I will try to go at a pace that allows for some questions and some thoughts and things like that. And I'll keep an eye on the time here so I don't go long. But anyway, there's kind of a lot of different things to think about, and I think the more we can understand the principles, the better off we're going to be when it comes to kind of deciding on the appropriate strategy for terminating cover crops and then also developing weed control plans. This is kind of a neat slide here that a colleague of mine put together that basically shows you the different stages of an annual weed and then where it might be susceptible to being suppressed by a cover crop. So, typically where cover crops are going to have the greatest impact on suppressing weeds is when the weed is in the, kind of in the germination stage or the white thread stage, when the weed is very young. Okay, once the weed is up and established, then the impact of cover crops or herbicides, for that matter, is much more variable. And so what the cartoons on the left here kind of show you is it basically shows you the different ways that weeds can be suppressed. And if you take a look at where competition takes place, competition with cover crops for space, for nutrients, for light, for water, you could add to that list as well. So competition takes place when the weed is in the white thread stage. So that's right after germination, when that root has emerged from the seed and it's at a very tender stage. The seedling stage would be right after it emerges from the ground. Those are also the stages where physical suppression, just the ability of that weed to push through some kind of a mulch and the energy that it takes to push through a mulch can be suppressive to weeds as well. And so that's where cover crop biomass comes in. The allelopathy thing is so hard for weed scientists to get a handle on that. It's not very predictable, and to be honest with you, I'm a lot less confident that allelopathy plays a major role than I am that physical suppression and competition is playing a major role. But anyway, it's kind of those three stages there: germination, white thread, and seedling are another place that allelopathy combined with competition and physical suppression can have an impact. And so what these three things here tell you is that one of the most successful way you're going to get weed suppression from a cover crop is to get it established before the weeds start to germinate, and then have a uniform stand and have something that's growing fairly aggressively. So again, just kind of an educational thing here that to maybe help you explain the benefits of cover crops to weed control should you be put in that situation. Right, I guess there was some animation in there. Okay, the other thing I like to say about cover crops and weed control is mare's tail or horseweed suppression by cover crops is extremely reliable. I mean, it's almost as reliable as tillage. And the reason for that is that mare's tail or horseweed does not like to compete with other plants. And so if you have a heavy stand of chickweed, mare's tail doesn't do very well. And so again, because we can seed cereal rye uniformly, the germination is uniform and it grows when we need it to grow. If you have a horseweed problem, using cereal rye can be one of the best things that you can do to either help or replace some herbicide applications. And this is just an example here of from a graduate student project. These plants here were collected from an area in a plot that had no cover crop. And then here's where the cereal rye was, and the plants that did come up were small and spindly and very easy to control by a herbicide. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that that I think we've been pretty that's been fairly easy to do is kind of correlate weed suppression with cover crop biomass. And so the question always is in the spring, you know, if I want to get weed suppression, how much biomass do I need? And so this here is from about a dozen different experiments that we did over a 3-year period of time, where we plotted the early season weed biomass by the early season cover crop biomass from a couple of hundred of different research plots. And so what this shows you here, so this is basically how much biomass do you have in the spring to provide some weed suppression that occurs with the weeds that are emerging in April and May. And what this shows you here is that when your cover crop biomass is between 0 and about 3,000 pounds per acre, so kilograms per hectare and pounds per acre are basically kind of the same value, you see a relatively noisy data set. Your weed suppression ranges from 0 to nothing when you're below about 3,000 pounds of biomass. So my guess would be if we were to break this out by species, you would see really good suppression of mare's tail with cereal rye. But if you looked at some of the other cover crops and suppression of something other than mare's tail, then that data is going to be really noisy and fairly unpredictable from year to year. When your biomass is from about 3,000 pounds up to about, say, 7,000 or 8,000 pounds, you see a much more consistent response. You see, you know, fairly decent suppression of a number of different weed species. You don't see a lot of data points up in this area right here. And I think for the most part, as we think about cropping systems in the Eastern Corn Belt, where we want the maximum amount of biomass produced, but we don't want so much that it interferes with crop growth and residual herbicide getting through the biomass into the soil. I think somewhere in these areas right here, this 3,000 to maybe 6,000 or 7,000 pounds seems to be a reasonable target to try to get to. Now, when we get into really high biomass situations, 8,000 pounds plus, you know, we see we have even more weed suppression. But in those really high biomass cases, I'm worried about early season crop growth, and I'm also worried about if we're using a residual herbicide, are we going to get that residual herbicide hung up on that biomass and we never get it down to the soil where we need it to do its job? So anyway, that's just, again, kind of a general perspective. This is Eastern Corn Belt data generated in my research program, and I put this together to kind of answer questions about how much biomass do you really need to get some reliable and meaningful weed suppression. All right, now, so one of the things that we have to do with our cover crops in the spring is terminate them before we plant corn or soybeans. And so we do have cover crops that winter kill. The oats and radish mixes will winter kill. We've actually had pretty good luck with killing red clover too. For some reason, we have a hard time getting that one to make it through the winter. There are also some mechanical means of doing this, and this can be tillage or mowing or those types of things. But, you know, really the chemical for the large commercial operations, it's going to be chemical termination of the cover crop that's going to be most efficient. The chemical termination obviously is not going to create concerns with like tillage does as far as your conservation program. And from an energy standpoint, it's going to be a lot less energy intensive than mowing. So that's what we're gonna focus on for the most part in this discussion here. I do have a little bit of a discussion of roller crimping that I'll have later on, but we're going to focus on on chemical termination. All right, so terminating a cover crop is a situation where you have to answer the same questions as you would if you were trying to pick a herbicide program to kill a weed. So the species that you're trying to terminate, the growth stage, the weeds present, the crop that you're going to be planted, your weather, and then, you know, contact versus systemic herbicides all play a role in this. And I wish it was as simple as, you know, everybody has a silo full of glyphosate and we just spray as much glyphosate as we need and it kills everything. But, you know, particularly this herbicide shortage situation is really going to require us to be, I think, a lot more smarter about using some of these other herbicides in our in our cover crop termination plan. So one of the things that that I would really have to compliment my colleagues at Penn State is just their whole program around cover crops in general, and then also some of the information out of their weed control guide in terms of which herbicides can be used to terminate specific cover crop species. So this is from their weed control guide. It's page 387 if any of you have purchased a copy of it. And they actually have a manual that kind of puts all the pest management recommendations in one cover. And so our weed control guide is kind of a separate publication by itself, but theirs is all under one cover. So I think there's a lot of good information in here. So this table here is what we call an efficacy table for terminating cover crops before planting soybean. So I've got a corn chart that I'll show you on the next page. And so the way to utilize this is, first of all, figure out what species that you're trying to terminate. And then secondly, what you would really like to have is you would really like to have herbicides that give you 9s and 10s. And so if we were going to walk through a situation here, so why don't we consider something like cereal rye? Let's just do cereal rye by itself to begin with. So with cereal rye, we're going to come to this column right here, and there's a whole bunch of 9s. Well, all of those 9s basically are glyphosate with something else. Okay, so and that's that's not rocket science. We know cereal rye is very easy to terminate with glyphosate. What if we're in a situation though where we're going to plant soybeans? We're going to plant, let's say we've decided that we don't want to spend the extra money for the dicamba or the 2,4-D trait. We want to plant straight Roundup Ready or maybe even a non-GMO soybeans. So if we plant straight Roundup Ready soybeans and we only have enough glyphosate for one treatment, where is that glyphosate best utilized? Is it utilized in the crop, or is it utilized for the cover crop termination? So the things that are going to impact a decision like that are how weedy is the field that you're going to plant these soybeans into. Is it a field where you have a lot of ragweed, morning glory, water hemp and stuff like that, where you really need that post-emerge glyphosate? Or is it a field that's relatively clean? If it's a field that's relatively clean, I would be inclined to let that cereal rye grow as long as possible. Either terminate at planting or after planting. This could be a planting green situation. You've utilized your one shot of glyphosate, terminated the cover crop, and then hopefully you're getting some additional weed suppression by the biomass produced by the cover crop. If you're in an extremely weedy field and your experience has been, it doesn't matter what cover crop I have in this field, I still have ragweed, morning glories, water hemp and stuff like that emerge later on in July, and I want to save my glyphosate for that particular treatment, well, then I can go down here to these gramoxone-based programs. Now, the thing with these gramoxone-based programs, though, gramoxone is not a big weed herbicide. With a gramoxone-based program, you're going to be terminating this cereal rye early, most likely sometime before it gets 6 to 8 inches tall in order to make the gramoxone work the best. But then you've saved the glyphosate for your post-emerge treatment. So, different considerations like that. So again, the other thing to think about too, if I'm terminating really early with a gramoxone-based program, I probably want to add a residual herbicide in with it because I'm not getting as much biomass production from the cereal rye. And then I need that residual herbicide to buy me some time until I can spray the post-glyphosate. So that's one scenario to think about. Another scenario to think about is, let's say you've got a mixed stand, and let's say you've got cereal rye and perhaps some red clover. Well, one of the things to remember about any kind of a legume species is that glyphosate can struggle controlling legume species. And particularly if you have a good stand of the legumes and your weather tends to be a little bit on the cool side. So in a situation like this, you're probably going to want to be cautious about planting green into a mixed stand of of cereal rye and red clover, because you'll want to terminate that red clover. All right, and then if you're growing a legume in a legume, unless you have a Liberty, or excuse me, unless you have a dicamba trait or 2,4-D trait or Liberty trait, it's going to be somewhat difficult to terminate that legume. So that might take you down the pathway again of either terminating early. So again, remember, we're going to grow a variety that doesn't have the dicamba or 2,4-D resistance trait, and so you're going to have a pre-plant interval for 2,4-D, and it's going to be at least a week for 2,4-D. Most likely it's going to be at least a month for dicamba. So it really kind of takes it takes the dicamba option off of the table unless you terminate really early. The 2,4-D, you have to factor in that pre-plant interval. You can't plant immediately. Or again, you go down here to one of these gramoxone-based programs. The gramoxone Syncor could be effective, and that would be another approach to take as well. So Stephanie or Tony, what I might do on this slide here, so again, this is soybeans. Are there any other scenarios that we should kind of walk through and talk about before we move on to the corn table?
So the only thing I was thinking, and let me know if you'll be maybe talking about this later. You kind of talked about using residuals in some of those scenarios there. Will you be kind of talking about or discussing like what you mean by that when you say residual, kind of like defining what a residual is for our attendees today, or do you want to talk about that now?
I've got some tables later on in the presentation, and I'll go over some of that in more detail.
What I was going to say is I think this is a nice table again for thinking about the options that are available. I like the columns again, thinking that, okay, try to find the 9s or find the highest numbers here, because those are the ones that are going to provide the best success. Tony, any thoughts? We maybe could hit on annual ryegrass here to kind of go in part with the scenario that we had earlier today as well. That might be one worth looking at.
Yeah, that might be a quick one. I like how this kind of ties things together as far as we need to think about this all as a cropping system, not just we are promoting cover crops. It all has to fit together. So this helps to do that.
Stephanie or Tony, would it be against policy? Would it be, I could see an extension using this, Bill's showing it, so he has confidence in these individuals. Is it possible that your folks can have this as a handout? Or is that given a recommendation? I mean,
no, this would be a very acceptable handout, because again, like you said, Bill has confidence in this. I'm sure he's played a key role in developing these tables and putting this information together. And so for us as conservation planners working with farmers to rely upon our extension specialists and our universities and the information that they've developed and prepared, that's what we want to see. And in fact, I know that we'll be working with Lisa and Shannon and others to get some digital copies of these purchased that we can share through the areas, and so that everyone will have access to these. I know Bill said that the hard copies are all sold out this year, but we'll get a couple digital copies that will then be probably placed on the S drives for the area offices, and then staff can go in there and grab them and look at them and print out what they need.
Because to me, it would be a say, you know what, here is, when somebody asks me the recommendation, I'm going back to that. Look, we've got a couple tables, and Bill, if these are the wrong words, just make sure I'm not, this is Purdue is sharing this table with us. Here are some recommendations. Work with your local ag retailer to see what works best for your operation. So it leaves them with this is what all they want is the name of these chemicals. I think it's a perfect graph, Bill. Are you okay with that from an extended perspective?
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. What I was going to say is I didn't know if you wanted to run through the annual ryegrass one, and then keep moving on. And Tony, unless you have any other thoughts or suggestions.
No, no other. Like I said, very acceptable to hand this out and give it to producers.
All right. Okay, so yeah, let's expand on that annual ryegrass discussion. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm gonna, if you can all see my pointer here. So here's the annual ryegrass column, and then we have two different numbers here. We have an 8 and a 9, which seem like they're relatively close. But the thing I want to point out here is that, you know, when glyphosate is $18 a gallon, we don't blink an eye about going from this rate to this rate, because even if you think about generic glyphosate, 4 pound per gallon glyphosate, the cost of going from this rate to this rate is about $3. No, let's see here, 18 divided by 4. It's about $4.50 to go from this rate to this rate. $4.50 an acre. With glyphosate being 80 bucks an acre, it's a lot more than that. It's more like 10 bucks. Actually 10. I got to calculate that out. No, it's like $20 to go from this rate to this rate. So that's a different decision. So I think the thing to really stress with your to stress with the people that are growing annual ryegrass is, if you're going to try to get by with the lower rate, be very cautious about the weather conditions, but then also add sharpen to the glyphosate. The sharpen is probably, it used to run about 8 or 9 bucks an acre. I don't know where it's at now. You know, a lot of the products that aren't heavily impacted by shortages have gone up anywhere from about 10 to 30%, but they haven't gone up 4x like glyphosate has. So again, if you're going to try to get by with that lower rate, add sharpen to that. Make sure your carrier volume is 20 GPA and that sort of thing. Let's see here. So again, here's our glyphosate plus sharpen treatment right here. And what you'll notice with the gramoxone-based programs, they're all rated pretty low. And again, the key right there, I think if you're going to use a gramoxone-based program, you know, here's one where they've added Syncor to it. And they don't have gramoxone sharpen in this one. We've also seen some benefit to adding sharpen to gramoxone as well. So, you know, key thing with gramoxone, again, is going to be carrier volume and coverage. So you want to be at least 20 GPA with a gramoxone-based program, and you want that annual ryegrass to be small. I think in Indiana, we would actually rate the gramoxone a little bit higher than what Penn State does. And they might be trying to terminate some stuff that's a little bit bigger. I think if we hit it 4 inches and smaller, we've had very good luck with gramoxone. So, okay, so that was kind of what I had to say about annual ryegrass. Was there anything else you wanted me to discuss with regard to annual ryegrass?
Nope, I think that's great. I think
good.
that you really hit on the concern of going at lower rates in an effort to save money, the risk that's associated with that for potentially unsuccessful termination. So thank you.
Okay, all right. So here is a similar table. This would be for corn. So the first thing that probably comes to mind is, boy, it seems like there's more rows of herbicide for corn. And there is, and you know, basically because we have a lot of these things that have atrazine or stinger in them, and the atrazine and stinger type of herbicides can really help with controlling the legume or the brassica type of cover crops. So I guess if we kind of think about some fairly common things here that we're going to see in front of corn, it's going to be legumes in front of corn. So you have your red clover, your crimson, your red clover, and your white clovers. So if that's your primary cover crop before growing corn and you don't have grass species in there, a mixture of 2,4-D and dicamba can be very effective, and it's going to be very cost effective as well. You know, if the clover gets a little bit of size to it, then you need to go with something that's a little bit stronger. Something with stinger in it can be very helpful. Stinger, if you buy stinger by itself, that's the chlorpyrrolid product. It's very expensive. If you buy it as a component of Hornet or as a component of Resicor, And Residual in particular is probably becoming one of our most common pre-emerge corn herbicides. Then the stinger component of that is much more reasonable. So stinger, dicamba, those are all very effective on the legume type of cover crops. Let's see if there's anything else here. You know, again, going back to if you have cereal rye or you're going into corn, your glyphosate-based programs are going to be fairly reliable. Again, here's some paraquat information here, and this is more along the lines of what I would expect. I don't know why those numbers were lower in the soybean table, but this is more likely to, you know, this is more comparable to what we would see. The beauty of using paraquat in corn is that you can put atrazine or metribuzin with it. So if one product is in short supply, you could utilize the other product, and that could help with the termination of the annual ryegrass. So again, I think, you know, terminating the broadleaf cover crops in front of corn is relatively easy. But then if you have to do a follow-up treatment, there's a number of different things that you can use post-emergence in corn. Most of them are going to be dicamba or liberty-based that are going to help finish them off if that's what you need to do from the standpoint of controlling broadleaves. Grasses, on the other hand, I guess it's my opinion that if you have grass cover crops, I would really try to do as much damage to them before corn comes out of the ground, because if glyphosate is in short supply, control of grass cover crops post-emergence in corn is challenging. And basically the reason it's challenging, if we cannot use glyphosate post-emergence in corn, you're stuck with trying to use some ALS inhibitors, things that have accent or basis in them, so nickel sulfuron or rim sulfuron. And those ALS herbicides are just not as good as glyphosate. They don't work well under cold weather conditions. If you spray them past the V6 stage of corn growth, you have crop injury concerns where you can have an impact on the ears of corn. Okay. All right, so that's kind of all I can think about in terms of the things that I wanted to discuss on this table right here. So Stephanie or Tony, is there anything additional that you'd like me to hit on?
I think it sounds good.
Okay.
Me too.
All right. Okay. Now, next part of this presentation, what I'd like to do is just kind of make you a little bit more familiar with the weed control guide. So this is the one that we work with Ohio State and Illinois on, and I just want to kind of give you some familiarity with the layout. So we have an entire section in the weed control guide where we talk about Burndown herbicide programs for corn or beans. And so this would be pages 23 and 24, and we have a short write-up of the main active ingredients that can be used, kind of what they control, and any sort of lookout information. You know, one of the things that we talk about as well are residual herbicides that have foliar activity, and we have a couple of those that are used very extensively in no-till crop production. So atrazine and atrazine premixes in corn, and then the canopy. And the canopy herbicides have Classic and Sencor in them, and those type of herbicides can be used in beans. But we also have some other, so those are probably the two most common ones, but we also have a handful of others as well that kind of fit into that scenario. All right, so again, that write-up is there. And then if you go to the next couple of pages in the weed control guide, we have more efficacy tables. So, you know, if you use the weed control guides for nothing else, these efficacy tables may be the most valuable thing that we have in there. So this table is a weed response to Burndown herbicides. We have the weeds listed across the top here, and we do have, well, we've got orchard, we do have things that could be considered crops as well. So orchard grass, and then red clover. And then that's the big reason I included that Penn State, those two Penn State charts in there, is because we don't have near the resolution on the cover crop Burndown stuff that Penn State has in their guide. And then these herbicides here can be applied in the fall. So in a cover crop situation, the only real herbicide that gets applied in the fall Occasionally we have some people applying some 2,4-D or dicamba in something like cereal rye if they have a bunch of winter annuals that come up at the same time as a cereal rye. So they'll put out 2,4-D or dicamba in the fall to get the broadleaves under control and allow that cereal rye to take off when it has the chance. Here's the spring programs. So again, we've got the single AIs, and then we have a lot of the very common mixtures with residual herbicides in here as well. And then what we expect them to do as far as providing burn down activities on these weeds. So one new herbicide that has just come onto the market this year is this herbicide called Reviton. So you're probably seeing some magazine advertisements and some internet advertisements for that. You know, maybe some of the retail outlets are carrying it as well. This Reviton is not revolutionary. Reviton is basically a weak sharpen. So it controls the same weeds as, say, flufinicil, and I assume they'll price it a little bit cheaper, but you know, it does kind of give you some enhancement of burn down activity with mare's tail, primarily as the target. We haven't evaluated it yet in terms of whether or not it helps burn down things like cereal rye and annual ryegrass yet. So if you see that herbicide, that's kind of what's going on with it. All right, so again, pick out which weeds that you have to control with your burn down herbicide. And again, chances are when you do your cover crop termination, there may be a few weeds that have emerged with it. And so if you know what species you have, you can kind of pick out which of these herbicides that you could add with that termination program that's going to give you some additional activity on the weeds that might be growing with the cover crop. So then the next section of the guide is where we've attempted to take a lot of text that's on herbicide labels and basically put it into a format that's a lot easier to digest. So you've picked out the herbicides that you want to utilize for your termination / burn down program, and now you want to know how to use it. So with 2,4-D, with the 2,4-D products, again, there's a number of different formulations here. So here are the rate ranges. This first bullet talks a little bit about the weeds that are controlled. This is the site of action group if you're keeping track of this in terms of trying to minimize selection pressure for resistance. Here are some warning comments. One of the things that we always say about 2,4-D, do not spray it plus or minus 7 days of planting time in corn because it can cause some injury. It's more likely to occur on light soils. So, you know, again, just some more use information here with 2,4-D. And again, we do this for every herbicide that's listed in that table. And what we try to do with this information here is rather than have you have to find a herbicide label on the internet and actually read it, we attempt to summarize a lot of the information that's on that label here. So here, for an example, are the chlorimuron containing products. And I told you there was a bunch of those. So again, these can be used with your burn down herbicides or with your termination herbicides in soybeans. But in order to get some foliar activity, you'll want to put that on with a crop oil concentrate. Okay, and then it does give you some rate restrictions here if you have high pH soil. So chlorimuron, you have to be somewhat cautious about utilizing it on high pH soils. All right, so that's how you would use the burn down section of that guide. So you're going to pick your herbicide out for terminating the cover crop. If there's other weeds that you have to manage, either from the standpoint of they're emerged when the cover crop is there, or perhaps I want some residual activity, then you're going to go and pick some of these out. And I still haven't gotten to the residual tables yet, but again, you're kind of building a program here is what you're doing with this termination and these additional herbicides. So one of the things that I think Stephanie was going to include in the materials that you have access to. So Travis Liglatter and I wrote these a couple of years ago. This talks about terminating annual ryegrass with herbicides, and we kind of show you some pictures here of the different herbicide programs that we evaluated and then the level of control. So we kind of go through a lot of the things that we we say that you need to be aware of in the event that you utilized annual ryegrass in your cover crop program. So that should be available. Okay, so we had a question earlier about roller crimping. So roller crimping, again, can be a very effective technique for terminating things like cereal rye. There are some folks now that are growing Valencia Clover. Valencia Clover has a hollow stem as well, and this one seems to respond pretty well to roller crimping as well. So we've just started messing around with Valencia Clover here. Actually, 2 years ago is when we planted it for the first time. So we're in our second year of experience with Valencia Clover. So the key thing to keep in mind here is the growth stage of the cereal rye is important to making this effective. And you basically want it when you have anthesis occurring, so relatively large cereal rye. And basically what happens is when you crimp it at that time, it has a tendency to just stay laid down. If you crimp it too early, it will stand right back up, and then you're still kind of in a situation where it could be competing with the crop. So I don't know, I don't have a real good idea of how many acres in Indiana utilize the roller crimper. Certainly a lot of interest in the organic area for doing that. But again, I think as we think about more and more non-chemical weed control tools moving forward, I certainly don't see the interest in this going down, in particularly with the effectiveness that we see with cereal rye in terms of suppressing weeds. So here are some different ways that these roller crimpers can be utilized. Some of these things can be mounted on the front of the tractor with a 3-point system on the front of the tractor. They can be mounted on the back of the tractor. There's some units here where you actually are doing the roller crimping on the front of the tractor, and then you have your soybean drill on the back of the tractor. Some of the ones that kind of intrigued me a little bit as I was building a planter for some of this no-till cover crop work that we're doing were these roller crimpers that actually mount underneath the planter frame right in front of the planting units. So that seems like a pretty slick idea, but I do think you have to have a lot of weight on that planter or really ideal soil conditions to make sure you have enough weight on that planter to get the openers into the ground. So I haven't done this yet to any of my planters. We're still doing the roller crimping as kind of a separate operation. But here's kind of the two different ways, or two different units. So this one on the left here basically roller crimps the whole area in front of the planter, and the one on the right here, you've actually got some cutting wheels that cuts through the residue in front of the crimper, and then you also have your openers, your planter opener wheels in that are going to be behind the crimper. So again, kind of a neat technique. And I know there's some of our large commercial growers, especially organic growers, that are doing some of these things and having some success with them. But I haven't tried these planter mounted units yet. So again, I think again, I'm just looking at it from my standpoint. A lot of interest from the organic farmers. I know that it's widely used in South America. I've got a South American graduate student. He says they're all over the place down there. These rolled mulches, when they're laying on the ground, can provide a nicer barrier in terms of providing weed suppression. But again, then you have to kind of make sure that rolled mulch stays down and doesn't grow right back up, or you're sort of back into a situation where it needs to be terminated with a herbicide. All right, so that was kind of my discussion on the roller crimper. So Stephanie or Tony, did you guys have any comments to add to that?
No, I think we're going to touch on that a little bit more, a few other tips here in our presentation as well. So we'll touch on that. And just to emphasize a little bit, you mentioned there's not a lot of acres with this. If we say roughly 10% of our acres are cover cropped, and then take a subset of that, what 1% or less of that is probably less is roller crimp. So we're really talking about a pretty small acres, but there is a wider interest of those who are heavily into a soil health management system. They are seeing some interesting results from that. So those folks who are kind of leading this are really kind of pushing us along into this.
In addition, Bill, we did get a comment in the chat, which I think is a good comment, and Tony hit on the fact that we'll go into this a little bit more later, but the comment talks about the feedback that this person is getting from folks and farmers who have tried using the roller crimper is that they have a hard time planting through it because their planters are getting clogged, and even with cutters and things like that. So do you have any additional recommendations on how to reduce that, reduce those clogging issues with the roller crimpers?
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm still relatively new to it. We're still doing it as a separate operation, and I bought an 8-row planter just to do this this planting green stuff that we're doing. And it's got liquid fertilizer on it as well. And you know, I wanted the liquid fertilizer for 2 reasons. One, to get the liquid fertilizer, but number 2, I can put some weight on that planter. So I think, you know, the whole planter setup thing is key. And then you know, I'm, like I said, I'm just not sure that these units that mount underneath the toolbar on the planter are going to allow enough weight on the planter. So so I'm new enough to this that I don't have good recommendations yet.
Erica, the only other suggestions that I would have, just, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is in these situations, if they're trying that roller crimper, to think about, consider possibly using that crimper after planting, that a living green plant might be easier to move and go through that field with the planter than after it's been laid down. But again, there could still be issues with all of that vegetation getting caught up in the closing wheels, getting caught up in the row cleaners, and so then all of a sudden you have to become a bit of a MacGyver, where you're like, well, let's see if we can take off the row cleaners, or see if we can change out one side of the closing wheels so we can have you know, a steel wheel or a rubber wheel, and then something with a different type of closing wheel on the other side. And so it becomes trying to figure out what will work and not get plugged or clogged while they're planting, which is a stressful situation because it's taking time to make that work while you're in the field wanting to get your crops planted. So there's a big learning curve. All right, Bill. Okay.
All right. So I think I'm going to skip this part here since we covered that earlier. All right. So so as we develop, so we've kind of talked about our termination strategies. We've talked about adding other herbicides to the termination strategy to help with some of the weeds that might be prevalent when we're terminating the cover crop. And the next thing we're going to talk about then is how do we build our summer weed control program. So basically we've done the termination, but we know we have these weeds in the field that come up almost every year. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing is we have to know how to identify the weeds. You can use traditional weed identification services. There's a couple of different apps that seem to be fairly reliable too, with kind of our main species, and that's the iNaturalist app, and there's also another one called Picture This, and there's a third one that I can't think of the name of now that some people have mentioned as I've given this presentation. So then we're going to go back to the weed control guide, and again, there's a number of tables in these weed control guides, or in our weed control guide anyway, that are very helpful in terms of picking herbicides and then giving some kind of simplified use directions. So much like the Burndown section, we have specific sections for either corn, soybean. We've also got small grains and pastures in there as well. And then, you know, very simple right up here, we talk about the different types of strategies, whether you want to do a pre-emerge, a pre-plus post, or a total post program with a residual. And then, you know, different fields where that might fit, different fields where it might not fit, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of those type of strategies. So the first thing you're going to do then is once you've kind of figured out that you've got your cover crop terminated, and this is probably part of that same decision process as well, but we want a residual herbicide. And so when we're in this herbicide shortage area where glyphosate and glufosinate are in short supply, and we've decided we want to use glyphosate in our termination strategy, let's say, the residual herbicide is the backbone. So this could arguably be the most important decision that you make right here in terms of being able to have a successful season of weed control. So we've got a table for grasses, we've got a table for broadleaves. So again, you're going to pick the weeds out of here that are your biggest headaches, and then let's see, yeah, you're going to pick the weeds out of here that are the biggest headaches. Most of these pre-emerge herbicides are fairly broad spectrum if they're an atrazine premix, and then that decision gets made. And so then your next decision then is, how do I pick the post-emerge herbicide? So you've got the termination done, you've added the residual herbicide to your termination strategy. Now you're 2 or 3 weeks after planting. No herbicide is perfect. So let's say you've got a couple of weeds that are kind of leaking through your termination and pre-emerge strategy. And so now we're going to kind of go into how do you utilize the tables to pick your post-emerge weed control strategy. So let's keep things kind of simple, that we have some foxtail, morning glory, giant ragweed, and lamb's quarter that have come through our residual herbicide or come through our cover crop plus residual program. So you can go down through this table and pick some herbicides that have 8s and 9s, and you come up with a whole list of different products. All right, so life is simple, right? Not exactly. So anyway, so some of these herbicides control grasses, some of them control broadleaves, some of them are going to have activity on both grasses and broadleaves. So obviously the easiest thing to do is probably go this route right here and pick a herbicide program that has some activity on grasses and broadleaves. But then the thing you need to do is you need to go back to your retailer and say, okay, what do you have? What can I get? So I'm going to go through a couple of examples here. So let's assume, well, all right. So anyway, you're going to prioritize which weeds are the worst. All right, are my grasses the worst? Are my broadleaves the worst? And the grasses are just kind of scattered. Is one weed really dominant? And an example I can think of is, giant ragweed is 4 inches tall when it comes out of the ground. I mean, it just grows like crazy, and typically that's a driver weed in corn. The other thing that you need to check on too, if your herbicide supply is short on glyphosate, is these alternative chemistries, the ALSs, the auxin, which would be the 2,4-D and dicamba, and then the bleacher type herbicides, Laudis, Impact, Callisto, Balance, and some of those can be somewhat injurious to some hybrids. Some hybrids have a genetic background that just makes them more sensitive to those active ingredients. And so we have to understand that as well. So that's information that's going to come from the seed company. So once you pick the herbicides, then let's say you're gonna put those on post-emergence. You may want to put it on with foliar fertilizer. You may want to put it on with an insecticide. You may want to put it on with a fungicide. You have to look at the label and determine, well, you could look at those write-ups, or you could look at the label and you could determine what is that stuff compatible with. There's some of the stuff you're going to dump in the tank and it's just going to turn to jello on the bottom of the tank. The other thing you need to check on are adjuvants as well. Okay. So again, where you can get that information is you can get that information out of the weed control guide. We have most of the really important lookout points that are summarized in these write-ups. So let's say, for example, we pick Impact Z and we want to add some additional atrazine to that to get some broadleaf control. Well, so Impact Z is topramazone and atrazine, but we want to add some more atrazine to that. So we're going to put that on with a methylated seed oil or AMS. If we have really active growing conditions and we want to reduce the risk of injury, we're going to reduce that MSO rate. If we put that on with some additional oil-based herbicides, so emulsifiable concentrate type oil herbicides. Or we could substitute and use a weaker adjuvant, something like non-ionic surfactant, rather than the methylated seed oil, and our injury potential would be less. So again, those are some of the comments that you can pick up off of that write-up. Well, let's say your retailer doesn't carry Impact, but he carries steadfast. And we know if we add some status to that, we can pick up the broadleaf weeds. So here's our steadfast write-up. Here's our status write-up. Here's the rate range. So again, with something like status, you're going to apply this when your corn has to be at least 4 inches tall, but not taller than 36, or the V2 to V8 growth stage. With steadfast Q, I believe the cutoff is 6 collars, so V6 is going to be the cutoff for that one. Best overall performance when applied to corn less than 12 inches tall. Do not apply to seed corn inbred. So if you're a seed corn grower, a lot of times those seed corn genetics can be sensitive to ALS inhibitors, and that's kind of one of those lookout moments for this particular herbicide. And then it talks a little bit about the adjuvants here. So we want to make sure that the adjuvants that we put with this are the same adjuvants that we would put with this one, because we want to set up that adjuvant system that maximizes the activity of both herbicides. So in this case here, if you use it, okay, so it can be used with non-ionic surfactant, crop oil, or a methylated seed oil, plus a nitrogen source. So for best results, apply with crop oil here. So when you put these herbicides together, you're going to use a crop oil and you're going to use a nitrogen source. So that takes the non-ionic surfactant out of the range there, because this one needs to be used either with a crop oil or with a methylated seed oil. It says non-ionic surfactant can be used, but grass control may be reduced. And so you would want to avoid, if grasses are your worst weed, you're really going to want to use a crop oil or a methylated seed oil, which would make it compatible with this status product. You can use crop oil or methylated seed oil with the status product as well. Okay, so again, just kind of restating here with these post-grass ALS herbicides, usually V6 is the cutoff. If they are applied after V6, you'll get kernel abortion on the ears, and so you'll have these ears that have little nubs on the end of them. So here's a list of these ALS herbicides. Again, if you don't have glyphosate, you're going to be using these. They work slower than glyphosate. And we do have ALS resistant foxtail in Indiana. We also have ALS resistant shattercane, and we have ALS resistant Johnson grass in the southern part of the state. And then these ALSs don't work all that well on crabgrass. So it's really going to be important to know your grass weeds are foxtail and not crabgrass. If you have crabgrass, then you're going to go back and use something like Impact for crabgrass. So, different things to think about too are the rain-fast intervals, and is it a specialty type of corn? So we have more tables in there that talk about the rain-fast intervals, the spray additives, and the growth stage. So again, if we're using the steadfast product, oops, I didn't copy enough of the page here. But anyway, it talks a little bit about, here's your rain-fast interval column. So it ranges anywhere from 1 to about 8 hours, depending on the herbicide. And then this here talks about the adjuvants and the crop growth stage restrictions. So if your corn is going to be used for silage, you're going to have feed, forage, and grazing restrictions. So again, let's see so here is status. No grazing restrictions if you use status. And again, here's steadfast. So steadfast, you have to use steadfast at least 30 days before you would harvest that corn for silage. So again, there's another place where the tables can be helpful. Are they labeled for use in field corn, popcorn, or sweet corn? So let's see if we can find the herbicides here. Let's see, here is status. Status is not labeled for sweet corn, but it is labeled for popcorn and seed corn. And then steadfast Q can be used in field corn, but it cannot be used in field corn grown for seed or popcorn or sweet corn for that matter. So again, that one's just limited to field corn. So again, helpful information where you can help these guys avoid a situation where they're not applying it to a hybrid that can tolerate it. Okay, So I know time-wise, Stephanie, I think we're kind of getting kind of close to the end here. Maybe any comments from you, or how do you want to proceed? I'm just going to kind of go through a few details in these newsletter articles. Otherwise, we can just take questions now if we're getting short on time.
I think we have about five minutes left, Bill, and I think that if you could highlight these articles that you have here, I think that this is an excellent resource for our employees and staff across the state. We haven't gotten a lot of questions at all in the Q&A yet, so just keep plugging away on these, because I think, again, as you were going through those tables, we might have some employees that are kind of wide-eyed and a little bit overwhelmed with thinking about all those tables, and I think these articles that you wrote with Brian and Marcelo kind of distill all of that down into some great resources.
Okay, all right. Okay, so there's some newsletter articles that we put together last fall with regard to this herbicide shortage issue. And as you start writing these things, normally I don't like to write really long articles because I don't think people read them. But as I started putting these things together, I just realized that there's so many things to consider when we get away from glyphosate and glufosinate. And I wanted to try to figure out ways to, I guess, to make things similar based on 20 years of working in this state. So one of the things that I did in this first one is I went through a number of examples here. And I think you can go through these examples and kind of see where I'm headed with these thought processes in the alternative herbicides, and some things will kind of make sense to you. So here in this first article, we talked about 4 different scenarios. No-till field with lots of bluegrass, lots of winter annual grasses, and there's a lot of foxtail in there. So if you can't use glyphosate, what can we use for a burn down treatment? Well, Corvus or Revulon Q at a full labeled rate, and those will help with the grasses. So again, that's kind of the message behind that one. What if that field above is going to soybean rather than corn? So again, we have several products that have metribuzin in there, and you can use paraquat with metribuzin, and it seems to synergize that activity, and so that's gonna help out with the broadleaf weed control. And then clethodim can be used for the emerged grasses, but the best place to use clethodim is going to be in the crop rather than in the burn down treatment, because clethodim doesn't work all that well in cold weather. Rimsulfuron is another herbicide that can be used in soybean, but it has to be used 30 days or more. So you could use that in a burn down situation if you didn't want to use gramoxone and you didn't have glyphosate, but that one has to be used 30 days or more. So the recrop interval is pretty prohibitive on that one. What if we have fields with lots of horseweed in it, basically broadleaf weeds? You might have some summer grasses in there. We're going to corn. So again, these broad spectrum premixes are a good place for them. You're going to add sharpen with them if you want some additional horsepower on the horseweed. If you have summer annual weeds that have emerged, you could add some gramoxone to that to take care of the summer annual weeds. So what if that field is going to soybean rather than corn? Again, here what you need to think about, it's kind of like our example earlier, which soybean trait are we going to plant? The soybean trait determines how aggressive we need to be with our burn down treatment. Soybeans can tolerate a little bit of weed competition early in the year. Corn, we really like to avoid that whenever we can. So if we're using a pretty robust trait where we might be able to use glyphosate, glufosinate, dicamba, or 2,4-D post-emergence, then maybe we could do something a little bit less aggressive with our burn down treatment. So again, those are kind of the scenarios. Listed a whole bunch of products in there. So I think if that scenario sort of fits what what's in your area, you could go to a retailer and say, do you have any of this list of whatever that is, a half a dozen products to use in that situation. Let's see here. So that was one article we wrote. We also talked about alternative burn down and post-emerge strategies when herbicides are in short supply. So again, here, this actually here was, there's about 5 of us weed scientists that put our heads together and said, okay, we need to come up with a list of things for people in all of our territory to think about. So, we spent about a week or so passing this back and forth to one another and just kind of giving some ideas here on different things to do if glyphosate or glufosinate are in short supply, and then some things to think about in terms of what weeds you might miss or what weather conditions could do to the activity as well. So here are some, and again, we have some burn down programs here that de-emphasize the use of glyphosate, and then what are some of the pros and cons of doing that. The other thing that came up as we were putting this together is folks wanted to know, what do I do with a multi-species cover crop mixture? And so we talked about some different things in here. I kind of figured that cereal rye dominates a lot of our acres. But there are other things that are occasionally with that cereal rye, and so here are some of the other active ingredients that can help out on the species that are in that mixture besides cereal rye. And again, the key thing with these things is do you want to control it when it's big, or do you want to control it when it's small? How much glyphosate do you have? Where is the best place to use glyphosate? And then what does your timing look like? So those are kind of, there's a lot of information in those articles, and it can take a while to digest, but I think if you find scenarios that sort of fit the area that you're in, they can be pretty helpful. And then, so again, Stephanie, I'll defer to you on this one since I know I'm running long on time. This is kind of the last thing that I had on my list here, and then, but maybe there's another place where we wanted to insert this discussion as well.
So Bill, I know I have about, I think I have about 3 or 4 slides on planting green considerations. So in this conversation here, we're leaving it up long enough for the attendees to look at it. And I think that's good. And if you have anything else, we can move on to that. Or if you're about finished now, we can pause for some questions, anything in the chat, and then give everyone a break before we go to our next presentation.
Okay, yeah, I'm kind of done with the formal part of my information, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, I'm checking the Q&A again. Not a lot in the Q&A. Hopefully the audience still knows that they are got to use the Q&A. We are getting some chats. I do want you to know, Bill, that I pasted the Purdue Pest and Crop newsletter articles in the chat so that they have immediate access to them, so they could be scrolling through them while you were talking about them. Let's see here. Oh, Hans did mention that horseweed is mare's tail, and that in the South they might call it mare's tail or something like that. And that's always the interesting thing when it comes to common names for everything out there, from weeds to native plants to flowers and all those things like that, because horseweed is something different for me too, but I knew what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, horseweed is giant ragweed where I grew up.
Oh. I always think of equisetum.
Yep, that's horsetail. Yep.
All right. All right, everyone.